Hi everyone! A few months ago, the LeBrant family put out a video titled Abortion Documentary, in which they compared abortion to the Holocaust. Unsurprisingly, they received a lot of backlash. As someone who is pro-choice, I agree that this comparison is absurd and offensive. But I wanted to break down precisely why it's an invalid comparison, and talk about comparisons in general. Ironically, I will be comparing two common comparisons, and arguing why one is valid and one is not. Quick disclaimer though, just because a comparison is valid doesn't mean it's always strategic or wise to make it. But this is not a video about effective advocacy. Watch my video on problematic comparisons for my opinion on appropriate versus inappropriate times to make certain comparisons. In this video, I simply want to analyze what makes a comparison valid or not. To engage in comparison is to evaluate the similarities and differences between two things. Typically, when we make a comparison, we are highlighting the similarities to illustrate a point. To compare is not to equate wholly, but partly. The purpose of comparison is to show how certain characteristics are equivalent. A false equivalence is defined as a logical fallacy in which an equivalence is drawn between two subjects based on flawed reasoning. In other words, the shared characteristics that are being highlighted are not actually relevant to the point that's being argued. When a false equivalence is made, the similarity is based on oversimplification or ignorance of additional factors. Put a pin in this definition because we'll come back to it. Let's break down the comparison the LeBrants made in their video. The purpose of the comparison is to convey the gravity of the situation. Abortion, like genocide, is evil. To compare abortion to the Holocaust is a false equivalence because 1. The vast majority of abortions occur before the fetus is even sentient. So they are comparing the destruction of sentient beings to the destruction of non-sentient life forms. 2. A fetus requires another sentient being's body to survive. The victims of the Holocaust were not demanding the use of other people's organs to live. And 3. There are reasonable justifications to abort a fetus, not wanting to endure the pain and risk of pregnancy and childbirth, not having the financial means to raise a child, etc. There was no reasonable justification to murder Jewish people. There are similarities you could draw between an embryo or fetus in the womb and a Jewish person. They're both life forms that contain human DNA. But these characteristics are not relevant to the point they're trying to make, that abortion and genocide are similar in terms of moral gravity. Because something being a life form that contains human DNA doesn't indicate a capacity to suffer, nor does it tell us anything about its relationship with others. Is it inflicting suffering onto another? Suffering is what matters in discussions about morality. In the case of most abortions, the embryo or fetus experiences no suffering. In the case of late-term abortions, you have to weigh the suffering of the fetus with the suffering of the host. To outlaw abortion is to disregard the suffering of the host, and grant special rights to fetuses that are not granted to humans outside of the womb. You, with interests and the desire to continue living, do not have the legal right to your mother's blood or spare kidney. So why should a fetus who has yet to develop these things have the right to your uterus? Removing a parasitic organism from your body is not comparable to murder. It's especially not comparable when you consider that most of these life forms being destroyed are not even conscious. To make this super duper clear, let's identify the key components of the definition we put a pin in earlier. A false equivalence involves oversimplification or ignorance of additional factors. Oversimplification means to simplify to such an extent as to bring about distortion, misunderstanding, or error. To claim that life begins at conception and therefore to destroy an embryo is to murder a human being is an oversimplification, because while life correlates with moral value, it doesn't equate to moral value. The error in this claim is that life equals moral value. This is erroneous because there are plenty of things that are alive that we don't consider to have intrinsic moral value, like microorganisms, for example. The additional factors that are being ignored include the bodily autonomy of the host, and the suffering that will result from carrying the pregnancy to term. We have to take the suffering of both the mother and the child into consideration. What kind of environment is this child being brought into? Poverty? Abuse? These are relevant factors because, again, suffering is what matters in discussions about morality. Now let's compare this to animal rights activists comparing animal agriculture to the Holocaust. The purpose of the comparison is the same, to convey the moral gravity of the issue. This comparison is also viewed as offensive, but is it invalid? Can we fairly say that the perpetual slaughter of billions of non-human animals for taste pleasure and tradition is no less evil than the extermination of millions of humans for political power? In my opinion, we can, because 1. Cows, pigs, chickens, etc. are sentient individuals with a fully formed brain and central nervous system. They are intelligent, social creatures who experience both physical and emotional pain. We are comparing the destruction of sentient individuals with the destruction of other sentient individuals. 2. Like other Holocaust victims, farm animals are not parasitic organisms relying on our bodies. They're not harming us in any way. And 3. Just as there was no reasonable justification for the Holocaust, there is no reasonable justification for consuming animal products. We can meet our nutritional needs without them. The comparison is apt because we're literally killing pigs in gas chambers, and the conditions on factory farms are strikingly similar to the conditions at concentration camps. If you're still bothered by this comparison, ask yourself, why is it uncontroversial to say that Holocaust victims were treated like animals, but very controversial to say that animals are treated like Holocaust victims? Those who take issue with this comparison point out differences between the Holocaust and animal agriculture, such as the intent. But this is a distinction without a difference. Whether the intent is to exterminate a group of individuals for political purposes, or to consume their flesh and reproductive byproducts for taste, pleasure, and tradition, both involve callous indifference to suffering. Or they point out differences between the victims. I'm not denying there are differences between humans and farm animals. You could argue that with higher order cognition comes a greater depth of experience and perception of pain. A chicken probably doesn't experience emotional pain at the same level as a human. You could argue that a human has greater moral value than a chicken because they have a greater capacity to suffer. I fleshed this out in more detail in my video Dismantling Human Supremacy, but ultimately, cows, pigs, and chickens are sentient, autonomous individuals who desire freedom from suffering. Their experience is similar enough to ours for them to be worthy of the same terminology that we use to describe human oppression. Despite having human DNA, a human has less in common with a fetus than it does with a cow, pig, or chicken. I can close my eyes and imagine what it's like to be on a factory farm. I can hear, I can see, I can feel things. But I can't close my eyes and imagine what it's like to be unconscious in the womb. To be unconscious is to not be having an experience at all. And unlike human fetuses, cows, pigs, and chickens don't rely on a host organism to survive. The experience of embryos and fetuses, if you can even call it an experience, is not similar enough to ours for them to be considered victims of oppression. I hope it's clear now that animal agriculture has relevant similarities to the Holocaust, while abortion does not. As a final example, I want to break down this iconic meme Joey Carbstrong made. If you're listening but not watching, it says, "I hate when vegans compare animals to humans." Also them, compares a pig to plants, and compares themselves to a lion. Carnists try to downplay the suffering of animals by pointing out the fact that plants are intelligent, living organisms too. This is not only an appeal to futility, but it's also a false equivalence, because the similarity they're highlighting is irrelevant. Being alive and able to process information and transmit signals is not what gives us moral value. Intelligence is not the same as sentience. Sentience is what matters. Equating intelligence or aliveness with moral value is erroneous. They also appeal to nature by comparing themselves to lions. Eating meat is justifiable, they claim, as it's part of the circle of life. Humans are animals after all, and animals kill other animals. This is a false equivalence because lions, unlike humans, are obligate carnivores. They need meat to survive. Necessity is the relevant factor being ignored. This meme is brilliant because it highlights the hypocrisy of carnists. Like, wait a second, you just insisted it was wrong to compare humans and animals, yet here you are, comparing humans and animals. Interesting. Not every comparison between humans and animals is valid. But to blanketly say you can't compare humans and animals is absurd. We should judge comparisons on a case-by-case basis. What exactly is being compared and why? Is there an oversimplification? Are there relevant factors being ignored? A lot of people judge the validity of a comparison on whether or not it's offensive. They strawman the person making the comparison by suggesting that they're equating the two things entirely. And then they knock down the straw man by pointing out the differences between the two things. But again, the purpose of comparison is not to equate wholly, but partly. I'm aware that there are differences, but can you explain why those differences are relevant to the point being made? Can you point out the false equivalence? If you can, I'd say you're right to be offended, but if you can't, I'd say you're not. I want to reiterate that just because a comparison is valid doesn't mean it's always effective. Although I do think it can be done in a tactful way, I would say it's generally good practice to minimize defensiveness when talking about animal rights, and explicit Holocaust comparisons tend to escalate defensiveness. Obviously, I'm willing to go there. I made this video, but I don't find campaigns like this particularly effective. However, consider the fact that comparing humans and animals is inherent to the vegan message. It's often explicit, for example, stating the fact that humans are animals, or pointing out similarities non-human animals share with humans. If it isn't explicit, it's implicit. You can try to dance around making comparisons, but someone is bound to ask you, are you comparing humans to animals? And if they do, don't insist that you aren't. It's obvious that you are, and to deny it comes off as weaselly. Just own it. Explain why the comparison is valid. Ultimately, the concept of animal rights is offensive to those who aren't open-minded to the message. Say something as benign as speciesism is similar to other isms, in that it involves discrimination based on arbitrary characteristics. And you'll hear, you can't compare speciesism to racism or sexism. They're different. It's likely that the person you're engaging with has no problem comparing homophobia to racism or sexism, despite the fact that they're different. Speciesism is not exactly like racism or sexism, just as homophobia is not exactly like racism or sexism. But they share commonalities. That's the point. The reason people find these comparisons offensive is because they're speciesist. So don't concede too much ground. Lastly, it's important to note that comparison is how we come to understand concepts. In fact, without the ability to make comparisons, much of what we call learning would quite literally be impossible. Compare and contrast is a key component of persuasion. And remember that persuasion takes time. People may not immediately concede, but if you make a strong case, you'll give them something to think about, which could lead to them changing their mind in the future. By avoiding comparisons, you're hindering your ability to make a strong case. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up and share it whenever someone insists that you can't compare humans and animals. Alright, peace out.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them